So what I've been asked to do is to talk about the really kind of amazing cutting edge research that has been done in just the last 10 years that's transformed our understanding of the causes and extent and indeed chronology of the Black Death, the medieval plague which struck Europe, Asia, North Africa, and indeed, as we now know, sub-Saharan Africa. It was especially virulent in the 1340s and 50s, and is estimated to have killed conservatively 40 to 60% of the entire population of those regions. And I'm hoping that this will be interesting on its own, for its own sake, but I will talk a little bit at the end of the lecture about what I see as the fascinating parallels, but also differences between the medieval pandemic and the modern pandemic that we're experiencing right now. So the two questions, I'll take up one very briefly. How did people of the medieval world understand the causes and spread of the pandemic that they were suffering through? And then we're going to talk about how recent research published in the journal that was started here at Illinois, the Medieval Globe, has begun to transform our understanding of this global pandemic. Oops, sorry, too many slides went by there. So one of the first things to bear in mind is that no pandemic comes out of a vacuum. It emerges out of both proximate, immediate, and also long distance historical causes and trends. And one of the trends that was exacerbating the mortality of the medieval Black Death in the 1340s and 50s was the fact that a generation or two beforehand, the population of Northern Europe in particular had been decimated by 7 years of famine. And so we have, for example, this moving account from England in 1316, lamenting that this seems to be the judgment of God, that in this year, and this is at this point the fourth or fifth in a year of successive famines, that plentiful rainfall is preventing the harvest from growing properly. People are starving, and the scarcity of food means that people are eating domestic animals and horses and other quote unquote unclean things. What the people of the 14th century did not know that we know now is that they were living through the end of a period called the medieval climate anomaly, or the medieval warm period. So what this image shows you here is that for reasons that we're still not sure about, one of them seems to be decreased volcanic activity in the South Pacific, is that the medieval, the entire world, begins to warm quite significantly at the end of the 8th century here. And you see the spike in warming trends. And for peoples living in the Northern Hemisphere, and this is not just Europe and Africa, but it's in the Americas as well, for people living in the Northern Hemisphere, this is extremely advantageous because it means that the growing season is longer. It means that a greater diversity of crops can be grown. You can grow wine vines in places in Northern England where you couldn't have grown them before, for example. And so this medieval warm period means an extended growing season for the peoples of the Northern Hemisphere. And so people are, unbeknownst to them, living through a period of relative prosperity. But what we now know is that this starts to change at the end of the 13th century. The climate cools again, possibly because of increased volcanic activity out of Iceland. Still not, this is a lot of fantastic work is being done on looking at ice cores to try to figure this out. So this is a global climate event, but in this case, it's not being significantly driven by human activity, the way our own period of global warming is. And eventually this downturn in the climate is going to lead around the year 1600 to what historians call the Little Ice Age, when parts of Europe, for example, became so cold that the Thames in London freezes over, even though it's a saline estuary. It's so cold that even these bodies of water are freezing over. So the famine is in part being caused by the cooling of the medieval climate. The other thing that medieval people know, they don't know about the cooling climate, but they know about the adverse agricultural conditions, is that they know that the plague that's beginning to affect them in the middle of the 1340s emerges from somewhere outside of Europe. And that this turns out to be not just medieval Orientalism, not just the demonization of an Oriental other, but it turns out to be true. And another English chronicler, Henry Knighton's best guess about this, and you can see that he's a survivor of the Black Death, that his best guess is that it must have begun in India, which for medieval people basically just means somewhere over there in the east. It then moved into Western Asia, and then it affected the Saracens, this is an opprobrious term for Muslims, and finally came to the Christians and the Jews. So again, Henry doesn't exactly know, but it turns out that he's getting it, he's kind of hitting it on the nose. And one of the reasons why Henry and his contemporaries know this is because they know that their world of medieval Europe is densely interconnected by trade and communication networks with the rest of the medieval globe, and not just with sub-Saharan Africa, and not just with Northern Africa, but as we now know, sub-Saharan Africa, and not just Western Asia, but as we now know, with the Far East, Far Eastern Asia. So, so Henry can imagine that the reason why the plague is traveling is it's traveling, he knows that diseases don't travel on their own. They travel with people who bring either animals infected by the disease, or furs or other commodities that are being traded that have fleas in them that carry the disease. Other chroniclers are aware that the vast commercial empires of Venice and Genoa, which are outsized players in this medieval global economy, have something very significant to do with the rapidity with which the plague is being transported. Medieval chroniclers become aware that the Black Sea region is a breeding ground for the Black Death, and they know that both Venice and Genoa have ports and ports of call in the Black Sea region. And we do know, and the chroniclers in the Middle Ages knew this, that Genoese sailors are the first to bring a shipload of merchandise, which also contains plague-infested rats and other vermin, from through the Hellespont here to the port in Genoa. And from there, it spreads very, very rapidly throughout medieval Europe. So another chronicler of the time, this guy, Gabriele de Musis in Piacenza, makes a special note of the fact that the Genoese are particularly hard hit. Scarcely 1 in 7 have survived. That in Venice, where an inquest was held by the Doge, more than 70% of the people have died. Now, these are medieval statistics, but again, given the proximity of the Venetians and Genoese to plague-bearing cargo, it makes perfect sense. He goes on to talk about how the rest of Italy, including remote Sicily and Apulia, southern Italy, have been virtually emptied of inhabitants. And we know that the situation in Italy now, during our own pandemic, is extremely grievous in both the north and the south is notoriously much poorer and much less able to combat the disease than its richer northern neighbors. Another interesting parallel with the medieval Black Death. And he also talks about how the heart of the Sultan, or this is the Caliph in Cairo, he calls it Babylon, that 480,000 of his subjects are said to have been carried off in less than 3 months, and that the Sultan is keeping track of this. And that, again, is completely plausible because Muslim bureaucracy was pretty formidable. And so here is this region that the Gabriele is talking about in his chronicle. What medieval chroniclers also know is that the Muslim conquests and campaigns that began in the middle of the 13th century have created new opportunities for interconnectivity and travel throughout the Central Asian steppes all the way to Beijing. It's this phenomenon that enables Marco Polo, the Venetian traveler, to travel from Venice with his father and uncle at the end of the 13th century and to spend 20 years at the court of the Great Khan. That is being enabled by this new interconnectivity of the medieval world. So again, medieval chroniclers and merchants are aware that their proximity to this region is something that is also enabling the spread of disease. And on just the last evidence of this, medieval chroniclers are also, however, very puzzled by the fact that the medieval Black Death presents in many, many different ways. And this is something that, and I'll talk about this in a second. We now know that this is true. For centuries, modern scholars dismissed medieval chroniclers as ignorant or stupid for not being able to accurately diagnose the Black Death. And it turns out there's a reason for that, because it manifests itself in the human body in 5 at least 5 distinctive ways. So here we see Agnolo di Tura, who here tragically remembering how he lost most of his family in the Black Death, saying that the illness seems to strike through breath and sight. So that sounds, irrational, but it turns out that you can contract the Black Death by breathing in particles directly into your lungs, and you'll die within hours. You won't have any sort of physical manifestation of the illness. So Agnolo was being very accurate here. He also is talking about how animals are eating the bodies of infected people. And we now know that animals, including dogs, can transmit the Black Death, can transmit Yersinia pestis, which is the plague virus. So even though Agnolo is not working with all of the information that we have, he's very, very perspicacious. So the bacillus, the bacterium causing the medieval Black Death, and as it turns out, causing the Justinianic plague of the 6th century and the great third plague pandemic in 19th century China and the Ottoman Empire, was discovered, it was named as a distinctive disease in 1894 by a Swiss physician called Alexandre Yersin, who was conducting research among people stricken by the plague in Hong Kong. And what Yersin realized, and that more recent medical research has confirmed, is that the plague is not just a bubonic plague. So you'll hear, it's quite frustrating to hear commentators in the media today talking about the medieval Black Death as the bubonic plague. That's only one part of it. You could, yes, the plague, medieval Yersinia pestis, or the Yersinia pestis bacillus, which still exists in the world today, can infect your lymphatic system, which leads to disfiguring and very painful pussy buboes. But if you contract this form of the plague, you're actually much more likely to survive it. Whereas if you contract the plague directly through your bloodstream, through a wound, that septicemic plague, you will die very quickly. I also mentioned pneumonic plague, which infects the lungs, much in the same way that the COVID-19 virus does. And also, plague can be transmitted gastrointestinally or pharyngeally if you eat animals. And medieval people, like many peoples in traditional societies today, eat dogs and cats and horses and other kinds of creatures that are infected by the plague. So you can also develop the plague in these ways. So the fact that medieval people are struggling to understand what is happening to them turns out to be very, very rational. There really is a lot of confusion, justifiable confusion. So up until about 10 years ago, the study of the causes and effects of the Black Death had pretty much come to a halt. There were 4 basic problems at that point. Was it just Europe and its immediate Mediterranean neighbors? Was it just rats? Or is there a bigger zoology? What's the real chronological spread here? Are we talking about something that really just occurred in the space of a single decade and with a few kind of intermittent flare-ups in the 16th and 17th centuries? And can we do this kind of work by just looking at documentary sources? And it turns out that the answers to all these questions are much more interesting and much more complicated than they would have been just 10 years ago when I was, when I would have been teaching about this to my students. So a conventional narrative and mapping of the Black Death, it used to be that it's really either 1343 or 1347 to 1350 or to 1353. This map just limits it to about basically 4 years. And this map also suggests that the Black Death is coming in from the Eastern Mediterranean, and it's infecting medieval Europe, and that's pretty much the end of it. So this was the sort of conventional I used to have a t-shirt with this on it, the Black Death European tour, woohoo, it's going from the Crimea to the Rhine Valley and from there into Italy and France and Spain. And it turns out that this chronology is much too short, and that rats are not the only culprits, and that medieval Europe is not alone because it's connected to the rest of its neighboring continents. So this narrative, this mapping, and this chronology have all proven in the last 10 years to be mistaken. And one of the major publications which helped to bring all of this new information to the world was started right here at the University of Illinois, as I proudly said earlier. We founded our own journal, The Medieval Globe, and its very first issue, and you can read all the articles in this issue in an open access online version. It was released online in November of 2014, and then it was published just a few months later in book format. And the mastermind behind this extraordinary research venture was a historian of medicine and public health, Monica H. Green, who used to be a professor at Arizona State University and has now retired and become an independent scholar, but is still very active, indeed one of the most important historians of medieval epidemiology and indeed modern epidemiology that we have in the world today. Something else, one of the things that led us to found this journal was the recognition that the medieval world system, as it had been famously defined by an anthropologist called Janet Abou-Lagod in an important book published more than 30 years ago in 1989, that Janet Abou-Lagod quite rightly thought about the medieval world as consisting of interconnected zones of interaction, of commercial and communication interaction. But what we have found out in the 30 years since Abou-Lagod published this book is that the medieval world system is much bigger and much more complicated than that. And so based on what we know now in 2020, the medieval world system also included sub-Saharan Africa. It included direct connections between especially Egyptian merchant communities in Egypt and South Asia. It included Indonesia and the Philippines. It included the Pacific Islands like Hawaii, which were of course being colonized by people from this region in the 11th century. So the medieval world system is even bigger than it was thought before. I helped to convene a conference just this past summer on the global north, which includes indigenous populations throughout the Arctic Circle, as well as European and Asian peoples. And of course, this is important for us because this is another reason why the Black Death is able to move from where we now know it originated in the Qinghai Tibetan Plateau here in Central Asia, and why it was able to spread throughout this medieval world. Now, we're still looking for evidence of why there seems to be no significant Black Death mortality in India. We're still not sure. We don't have evidence from Indonesia about whether it was making it as far as that. But again, we're only just at the beginning of this new phase of research. So even though medieval people knew that they were part of this interconnected medieval world, they could have had no way of knowing, as we now know as of 2013, that this is the home of the Black Death, the Qinghai Tibetan Plateau here. This is a region of southwestern China, which is very hospitable to Yersinia pestis. It turns out that Yersinia pestis likes cool, dry conditions. And here's where the cooling of the medieval climate becomes significant, because that cooling is going to be just enough to enable the Black Death, to enable Yersinia pestis to become endemic, to become embedded, not just in the Qinghai Tibetan Plateau, but in parts of Europe. And it's also now continues to be embedded in parts of the Americas, Africa, and Asia. So this is the very, very favorable incubator of Yersinia pestis. So the new story that we're able to tell really begins in 2011 when a team of scholars was able to, thanks to the help of historians and archaeologists, was able to locate a Black Death cemetery in East Smithfield, London. That ancient DNA from the teeth of Black Death victims was then used to reconstruct the genome for the very first time of Yersinia pestis. So that was a major breakthrough. Just 2 years later, a team of Chinese scholars led by Cui et al. Published in 2013 this phylogenetic, basically family tree of Yersinia pestis. Like all living organisms, this has a family tree. And here we're seeing its origins. It may be as much as 2,000 years old. The first time that it breaks into the historical narrative is in the 520s here. This is the Justinianic plague, which affected the Eastern Roman Empire under the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century. Justinian himself contracted the disease, although he recovered from it. His empire didn't, but he recovered from it. What you're seeing here are mutations of Yersinia pestis. And then here, what geneticists and scientists would call the polytomy, or what we could say in the vernacular is the Big Bang. This is the perfect storm of conditions that enable Yersinia pestis, which has been embedded on this Qinghai Tibetan plateau, the cooling of the climate, the movement of the Mongols through this region and from this region east into China and west into Europe and Africa. All of those are the conditions which enable it to explode. And then, of course, it doesn't just explode once, but it continues to mutate into various forms. So here's a special East African strain, which was identified in, and which seems to have been born in the late 15th century. And I want to come back to some of these dates because they're really, really interesting. So Tree et al. Was able, thanks to their look at the sequencing, thanks to their construction of the Black Death's of Yersinia pestis' family tree, were able to locate it to that region, the Qinghai Tibetan Plateau, as I mentioned. And here are the geographic sources of the DNA strains that they were able to collect and examine. In case you're interested, because you're pricking up your ears and thinking China, yes, China, and here we have Wuhan. It's in a very different part of China. Of course, China is a vast, vast state that, like Yersinia pestis, the Wuhan coronavirus was transmitted from animals to humans. As we know, that was the same with Yersinia pestis, but it happened under very, very different conditions and in a very different kind of climactic moment. So just to put that in perspective for you, we're talking about two almost opposite ends of China here. And then just calling attention to these dates, that what this mapping of the family tree of Yersinia pestis reveals is that actually Yersinia pestis may have been active 200 years before it manifests itself in medieval Europe. And what we still don't know, we don't have enough evidence from Chinese sources and other Asian sources to know whether it was actually causing mortality in Central Asia hundreds of years before it makes it to Europe. One of the contributors to that issue of the Medieval Globe, Robert Symes, who's a historian of China at Columbia University, Bob Hymes's very important article looks at Chinese medical treatises, which Symes is able to show start around the 13th century, so 150 years before the Black Death in Europe. We start seeing Chinese physicians who are very, very sophisticated, talking in kind of euphemistic terms about a new disease, which they don't have a name for, but for which rhubarb turns out to be an effective treatment. And it turns out that rhubarb actually is an effective treatment for Yersinia pestis. And so Bob Hymes's hypothesis is that actually if we read between the lines of these Chinese sources, we see Chinese physicians trying to deal with outbreaks of plague. These are not reported in Chinese historical chroniclers for reasons that remain obscure, but might have to do with the fact that Chinese historical chroniclers work at the service of the state, and the state does not want them to be reporting on this, which might be another really interesting, I don't know enough about that to hypothesize, but that could be another interesting modern parallel. So again, not only is this map too small and the narrative too narrow, this dating is ridiculously off. You know, yes, the Black Death may have been reaching Europe in the 1340s, but it seems to have been affecting other parts of the medieval world earlier. Moreover, the fact that the narrative of the Black Death and the narrative of plague in the West up to the present moment is always a narrative of Orientalism. It's always a narrative that plague is always coming from somewhere else. It's always coming from the East. And that turns out not to be true, that yes, Yersinia pestis originally makes its way to Europe as a result of movement from China. But once it occurs in Europe and North Africa, it stays there. It never goes away. And this we are beginning to understand from another really important article published in that issue of the Medieval Globe by a scholar called Anne Carmichael in Indiana. And here is Anne's map of outbreaks of the plague in very rural, remote, isolated villages in the Southern Alps. And we know about these because Milan, a city right at the epicenter of the plague outbreaks now, the outbreaks of coronavirus and COVID-19 in Italy, that Milanese officials were very vigilant about plague. They kept track of all of these outbreaks, even in the remote alpine villages, because they wanted to make sure that none of these people brought the plague with them to Milan. That's why we have this evidence from the spring of 1567. So what's happening? It's spring, it's still cold, but people are traveling. And those are the conditions in which, as we know, and perhaps medieval people did too, that Yersinia pestis is very active. But we did not know until Anne Carmichael did this historical work that medieval administrators were aware of this. And it turns out that the Alps and the Pyrenees and other mountainous regions of Europe are excellent incubators of Yersinia pestis, that they have some of the exact same climactic conditions, cool, dry conditions as this part of China. Moreover, they have a zoology which is very, very, very similar to that of Central Asia. And again, it's through human contact with animal hosts that Yersinia pestis outbreaks tend to occur. So we now know, for example, that one of the furs that was favored by the Mongols was the marmot. Marmots are huge rodents. They're almost 3 feet tall. I'll show you a picture in a minute. And that marmots are a favored host for the fleas that carry Yersinia pestis. And so the Mongols are dressed in these furs, and they're wearing these furs as they move from the Qinghai Tibetan Plateau into the rest of the medieval world. But moreover, marmots are also indigenous to the Alps and to other alpine and to other sort of mountainous regions of Europe. And I'm showing you here adorable little marmot with his eating an orange. I'm showing you here a little Swiss boy who is in really uncomfortable proximity to a bunch of marmots whom he's trained. Marmots are very human friendly. We know that in medieval and early modern Europe, the people who lived in these little alpine villages would supplement their income by training marmots to dance. And they would bring the marmots with them into the major cities like Milan and earn money busking with their dancing marmots. And of course, it's going to be cha-ching, precisely that sort of behavior that's going to be spreading plague unwittingly into major metropolitan areas of medieval Europe. So this helps to explain, as Anne Carmichael shows us, why in these tiny little alpine villages, there are chapels dedicated to saints who are known to cure the plague. So I'm showing you here this tiny little village called Landevillard in French-speaking Switzerland, which has on the walls of its chapel, and notice this chapel is not built during what we think of as the Black Death. It's built 100 years later. Why? Because people in the French Alps are still experiencing outbreaks of the Black Death. And it's showing us a physician lancing a bubo. Here is a woman, this is what happens. This is your lymphatic system. That's what the buboes are attacking. Underneath the elbow, her little son showing, you know, oh, my mommy, my elbow, my joint here hurts. I mean, this poor little baby, is the baby sick? Is it dead? So again, it had always been mysterious why people in these tiny little villages were dedicating chapels to Saint Sebastian, who was a saint known to, or thought to cure the plague, thought to be efficacious for curing the plague. And it turns out it's because plague is living with these people and it doesn't go away. So not only is the marmot a successful host for Yersinia pestis and the fleas that carry it, but, and again, he likes people. So you have marmots being fed by village people, not knowing this, that you have marmots living in people's houses. But dogs, domestic animals, can also carry and transmit Yersinia pestis. This is not the case with coronavirus. Just want to emphasize that. Horses, camels, and camels are eaten in many cultures in the medieval and modern worlds. So that's another way you could get gastrointestinal plague. Birds of various kinds can carry it, and bird droppings. So birds who are migrating over territories can carry it. And of course, you know, cute little beings like bunnies. So all these adorable little animals can be hosts for the plague. A little gerbil here. So again, rats have been wrongly maligned as the major plague carriers. And if we think back to Angelo Dictura and his insights about, dogs being, eating bodies, people might be then eating dogs, and the whole cycle continues. And he also mentions, and it sounds like hyperbole, but it's not. So many people died that lots of people thought it was going to be the end of the world. And I'll be giving another lecture in a couple of weeks about the world after the Black Death, but just to give you a sense of what this major mortality looks like on the ground. Another contributor to our issue of the Medieval Globe, a historian, Stuart Borsch, who works on medieval Egypt, is able to show that irrigation systems in the Nile Delta, irrigation systems that had been built and maintained since Pharaonic Egypt. So they have been in this is an infrastructure which has been in place for 4,000 years, are being abandoned for the first time around 1400 because there are not enough people to maintain them. The interconnectivity of the medieval world means that, as another scholar, Gérald Schwinn, who teaches at College of William and Mary, in an unrelated article published right before our journal came out, he is showing that plague is making it to sub-Saharan Africa because enormous medieval urban earthworks in what is now modern Nigeria, which had been constructed hundreds of years before, are being abandoned and not maintained for the exact same reason, because so many people have died that these massive infrastructure projects cannot be maintained. And then I just want to say, finally, one of the lessons that we've learned from studying the archaeology of the Black Death is its consequences for vulnerable minority communities in the medieval world. And I'm going to show you a couple of disturbing images that were from a Jewish cemetery at Tàrrega. This is a small town west of Barcelona, as you can see here on this map, where there had been a Jewish community living side by side with its Christian neighbors for hundreds of years. But in 1348, as a result of the crisis of the Black Death and the stresses of the Black Death and the terror of it within the community, that the Christian neighbors of these Jews in Tàrrega took this opportunity to violently attack their Jewish neighbors, to destroy the calle, the Jewish ghetto. This is the Catalan word. That they accused the Jews of being traitors. This is a medieval anti-Semitic trope that Jews poison wells to kill their Christian neighbors. They raided Jewish homes with weapons, farm tools. And when they got there, they robbed their Jewish neighbors and also burned legal instruments, that is, receipts and contracts of the debts that they owed to their Jewish neighbors, and then murdered them. And we have written evidence of atrocities against Jews during the Black Death. And this one, as you can see, Monica and I translated from a Latin and Catalan document that still exists in the Royal Archives in Barcelona. But what we have never had before this article was published in the Medieval Globe was both specific written evidence and the archaeological evidence for this. And I'll show you that in a second. But again, I want to emphasize that it was that the Christians of Tàrrega had been taught for hundreds of years by the medieval Roman Church that Jews are greedy and rapacious, that Jews control the economy, and that Jews are always looking to savagely rip off their Christian neighbors. So that's one of the things that's driving the Christians in Tàrrega. And moreover, the medieval Roman Church had insisted and legislated in 1215 that all Jews in medieval Christendom should be clearly distinguished from their Christian neighbors by the wearing of a Jewish badge. And this badge took different forms in different regions. Sometimes it was a hat, sometimes it was a cloak, sometimes it was a square of cloth. And I'll talk more in my next lecture about the unfortunate kind of uptick in anti-Semitic violence in Europe after the Black Death. So these are some of the images of the graves which the surviving Jews of Tàrrega hewed out of the living rock in order to belatedly bury their family members and neighbors. We know that they were burying them belatedly because the remains in these graves showed that they were buried in a very advanced state of decomposition. That means the bodies had been left unburied for a long time before the survivors felt comfortable to come out of hiding. Um, and so I won't go more into that. But we also know that they were buried according to Jewish custom. So these are not mass graves into which bodies are being dumped willy-nilly. These were lovingly dug. Moreover, the evidence, the forensic evidence of the individuals in these graves shows us that yes, those spears and axes and farm tools that were mentioned in the royal record are what's being used by Christians to kill their Jewish neighbors. So what do we now know? Thanks to all of this new research, we have a much bigger map of what's going on, of how Yersinia pestis is spreading. We have a much bigger zoological component, many different kinds of animal hosts that can, themselves are not dying of Yersinia pestis, but which can transmit it. That we have a chronology which extends from as early as the 13th century to at least the 19th century. That is, the Black Death doesn't end, it continues. It doesn't stop in the 1350s. And maybe most methodologically significant, and this is, I think, the most hopeful thing about this, is that the historians are now finding effective ways to work with and dialogue with not just humanists and social scientists, but with our colleagues in microbiology, bioarchaeology, physical and biological anthropology, and obviously epidemiology, many other fields. And the kinds of work that Monica Green and colleagues are continuing to do are to look for other evidence that would enable us to learn yet more about pre-modern conditions for plague. So, for example, we need to do much more work in Asia and in Africa to try to find similar evidence that we've been able to find, ancient DNA evidence of the kind that we've been able to find from China and from Europe, for example. And we need to be wedding this scientific evidence to other types of documentary and epidemiological evidence in order to come up with new information. I mentioned that plague continues to be endemic in many parts of the world. It seems to have been eradicated from Europe at this point, but here's its home. It still has lots of places to live in parts of the world. And then I'll just close with just my few thoughts on what are the differences and what are the similarities between the pandemics that we're living through, the pandemic we're living through now and the pandemic of the Black Death. Well, interestingly, climate plays a role in both cases. In the case of Yersinia pestis, though, it's cooling climate. Yes, medieval people had a deleterious effect on their climate, as I mean, human beings have been affecting the climate adversely since the Neolithic Revolution. It's sort of a feature, not a bug of civilization. But medieval people had not been told by scientists that they were having a deleterious effect on their environment. And moreover, in this case, their environment is cooling. In our case, we know the environment is warming through man-made activity. Whereas COVID-19 has a relatively small handful of detectable symptoms, which we are all learning to know, fever, dry cough, body aches. The medieval Yersinia pestis had multiple manifestations, some of which were undetectable. And it had no known cure and no treatment, no effective known treatment, except for rhubarb that those Chinese physicians were thinking about. And of course, nowadays we know some treatments. We don't have a cure, we don't have a vaccine, but we know that there are some ways to treat it. And the technology that is necessary for that, like respirators, are desperately needed. But here are the things that are actually quite similar about these two pandemics, is that they're both caused by overpopulation of the globe. Obviously, this is overpopulation at a different scale in the Middle Ages, but Europe and Eurasia were so densely populated in the 14th century that every single square foot of agricultural land was under the plow, and it was under the plow to grow a very, very small number of crops. So that also means that the soil is being depleted of its nutrients. As I've mentioned, there's globalization is accelerating in the 12th and 13th centuries, creating the conditions for humans to travel more widely, more quickly. Again, at different scale, but it's still a very similar phenomenon. Just as today, transfer of invasive animal and plant species. Medieval people, like modern people, get excited about new animals and plants, and they move them from one part of the medieval globe to another. So rabbits are being introduced into Europe from places like Egypt and are in the 11th century, and they're incredibly destructive. And that's a problem. Animal to human transmission. Both of these diseases are known to have originated in animals who are not affected by them to humans that are. And in very ironically, the most medieval of ways to deal with plague turns out to be one of the most effective ways that we have now, that the containment of the disease. And then something else that we're seeing, which is a very similar, either when we're talking about the medieval response to Yersinia pestis or the modern response to the Black Death, is that treatment dealing with this disease is hampered by willful ignorance or real ignorance, rumor, false information, uneven responses, and the scapegoating of or violence against vulnerable others. And that is why, for example, my department has issued a statement condemning President Trump's racist insistence on calling this the Chinese disease. That's very much the kind of response that would have led the Christians of Taraga to kill their Jewish neighbors. So I just want to have a special thanks to Monica Green, who's still out there working. I would, if you're interested in what she's saying about our current pandemic, I urge you to follow her on Twitter. It's one of the ways that she gets her scholarship out there. And she's going to be preparing a new paperback edition of our book that should be very cheaply and widely available later this summer. And I'm happy at this point to answer questions that anybody might have.